UFC 273 in Jacksonville this Saturday has so many great fights, so many. But let's talk about one of the co-main event, Petr Yan versus Aljamain Sterling, the long-awaited rematch. So for those who don't know, the first match ended in a controversy where Aljamain Sterling was basically winning the beginning of the fight, but then he started gassing out and Petr Yan was starting taking control. And then Aljamain Sterling during a scrap was basically with one knee on the ground and was a downed opponent, and Petr Yan landed an illegal knee which turned out into disqualification. And this is the whole reason the entire fight has such an insane story and there was so much drama around the fight. It's not that it was just the illegal knee, it's the antics that Aljamain was doing after being kneed. Because no one argues that hey, it was illegal and he won fair and square by disqualification. Everybody hates the antics that Aljamain was doing, rolling on the ground, rolling his eyes and so on. He might have been hurt, but you could see there was some weird antics going on, throwing the belt on the ground and then 15 minutes later celebrating with the belt. So where does the truth really lies? Was he really hit illegally like Anthony Smith, and Anthony Smith decided to continue? Was he really hit by the knee after the belt like Michael Bisping when he fought Anderson Silva? All those guys decided to continue the fight and they didn't protest. However, in the case it was very different, but it is in the past. And so the narrative was that Petr Yan is an insane favorite. He is minus 475 betting odds favorite for this fight. And I think that assumption comes from the antics of Aljamain Sterling, how they approached the fight and how he was gassing out, and that Petr Yan was composed, except the mistake he made. So let's analyze this rematch, because it's those two guys basically are the top of the division in the bantamweight, and they're one of the best fighters in the division. So what makes them best? First of all, let's analyze the challenger and the betting odds favorite, Petr Yan. Petr Yan is basically one pound for pound, one of the best ex-champs, best fighters in the world. His striking is next level. His game IQ is next level. He's checking all the boxes. He has some ground game. The takedowns, basically the leg sweeps that he does, the judo takedowns are just insane. And the way how he uses the shell defense and basically just controls the fight is insane. He trains the Tiger Muay Thai, and Tiger Muay Thai is known for training a lot of solid fighters, one of which is Alexander Volkanovski or even Valentina Shevchenko. So Tiger Muay Thai has so many high-level strikers, and Petr Yan is one of those. So we know what he brings to the table. We know that he always starts the fight, he's filling out his opponents, and then he proceeds to basically demolish them and take them apart. He's very skilled and very great fighter. On the other side of the octagon, we have Aljamain Sterling, who is just funky, funny, and basically just entertaining. He's just all over the place. There's when he goes into the octagon, there's just this outburst of energy, which works in a 3-round fights, but for a 5-round main event, it can be, problematic, as we've seen in their first match, when the Aljamain was just all over the place in the first 3 rounds, which might have been a result of, being a little bit stressed, acting little, what to do, blah, blah. And then he was gassing out, But we've seen how he demolished Corey Sandhagen, so he's also for real. And his grappling skills, he has a black belt in Jiu-Jitsu under Matt Serra, that speaks volumes. So his ground game is legit. So how does this fight and this rematch can look like? I believe that this fight is more mental than anything else. And there is some cases that can be very bad for Petr Yan, some cases that can be very bad for Aljamain. So let's go through them. The first approach from Petr Yan, I'm very afraid that he will be overconfident. What I mean by that, I mean that it's similar when the Deontay Wilder almost knocked out Tyson Fury in their first fight. And the way he approached the second fight was basically, it looked like, I would just knock him out. I just need to land that one punch, Basically, he was going into their rematch thinking that he already won. That's not a very good approach. And I'm afraid that Petr Yan is believing himself okay, I want to punish this guy. But in the back of her head, he thinks oh, it's going to be an easy fight. which is not true because Aljamain Sterling is a very tough opponent. So this is one of the cases that I really believe and I really hope that Petr Yan should do careful game planning and should not underestimate Aljamain just solely based on the antics that follow the disqualification. Because at the end of the day, he's still a tough fighter. And so he shouldn't be underestimated. So if Petr Yan doesn't underestimate him, I think that Petr Yan can take control of the fight and can win pretty easily. You know? On the other side, Aljamain Sterling has also huge mental attributes that he has to approach towards this fight. And what I mean by that is that, first of all, he needs to approach this fight like, hey, even though I'm a champion, I still should have the mentality of the challenger. You know, because even though it was a disqualification, I cannot basically just slow down. He had a huge chance to basically witness what the 5-round fight with the Petr Yan looks like. So he had a chance to work on his cardio, you know. Third of all, he knows that he's a much superior grappler. He knows, like, he said it himself in the media that, like, basically just wasn't going for the takedowns, wasn't going for the, you know, for the, I would say, forced clinches and forced grappling exchanges, you know. And if he does those things, it can very look like, you know, like which fight? Like Brandon Moreno and Deiveson Figueiredo's second fight. Because in the first fight, even though Brandon Moreno has much better grappling, Deiveson Figueiredo is a good grappler, but there is levels to it. And Brandon Moreno is much better grappler. So in the second fight, you know, in the first fight, they were just scraping, going for 5 rounds, right? It was an amazing fight. By the second fight, the Brandon Moreno was like, you know, fuck this. I'm better wrestler, I'm better grappler. I'll just take him down, I'll force it, I'll take his back and I'll submit him. And he made it look super easy. Even though Deiveson Figueiredo is a legit fighter and current champ. So I believe if Aljamain Sterling will try to do something with a similar approach as Brandon Moreno, because he is indeed a superior grappler, and he's also bigger. He's so big for the division, you know, he has super huge reach, and he's like just a perfect grappler. So if he tries to force those grappling exchanges, I think it can be a huge problem for Petr Yan. Even though Petr Yan is just all-around great fighter, and Aljamain Sterling didn't achieve anything in those sorts in the first fight, I think the stress, you know, and the highlights was just like the very big problem of it. I believe Aljamain approaches this fight with a different mentality. So he either will try to force those grappling exchanges, or he will just, you know, be more relaxed, look for the opportunities, and just make sure that he doesn't gas out if indeed he cannot submit or take down Petr Yan. Because if he can do those two things, I think it can be incredibly increase his winning odds. On the other side, I really hope that Petr Yan is not underestimating Aljamain Sterling, because fans were just making fun of Aljo, you know, and he heard that, and I think it makes him angry, and I think that's why he is approaching this fight with not just a caution, but he's really preparing, and he looked ripped. So I think that Aljo is super angry, and he's just going to make a statement. That's what he said, and if he really means it, I believe that this fight should be much closer than people think. I think the narrative is that Petr Yan is going there to demolish him, you know, as he was basically doing it in the first fight. But people forget, in the first fight, in the first couple rounds, Aljo was the one doing the pressure. I know Petr Yan landed a couple shots and, you know, and scored some takedowns, but Aljo was, you know, doing the pressure, and Petr Yan was just basically just defending himself. And even though his defense is amazing, let me tell you one thing: the defense doesn't score points. You know, it doesn't matter if you're Floyd Mayweather of MMA. The defense doesn't score points, you know, so you have to do something in the fight. And Aljo was like, the first fight was very close. You know, it ended right at the time when the Petr Yan was grabbing the control of it. And I think that's why people think like, oh, he will immediately win, because that's how it was going. And it will basically be the same exact scenario in a second fight. But I believe that it's not going to be the case. I believe the second fight, it's either going to be like Moreno versus Figueiredo 2. You just like, Petr Yan will just knock Aljo out, or Aljo will submit Yan. Or we'll see 5-round fight that's going to be much closer, similarly as Davison Figueiredo and Moreno, their first fight. They are very similar, and I think they can go both very similar ways because both of the fighters are very similar, you know. Figueiredo has insane power. Petr Yan is an insane striker, you know. Moreno has a crazy grappling skills. Aljamain has a crazy grappling skills, you know. So I think the fight between Moreno and Figueiredo should be great inspiration for this fight. It can end in a very similar manner, and I believe the odds should not be that far apart. It's basically laughing at Aljamain even despite all the antics. I understand the antics were a little bit too much, and I understand the people trolling him, but people should not forget that he is still one of the best fighters in the division, regardless of his acting performance. He is still one of the best. And if you're one of the best, you can always upset or defeat the other guy. So I hope that Petr Yan is approaching this fight in a calm manner, because this fight has a potential to be fight of the night. And I believe that this fight, both fighters have an insane potential to demolish the other one and shut all the haters up. If it's Aljo proving that he is indeed the champion, that he is indeed the threat of the division, or if it's Petr Yan cementing himself as one of the best pound for pound fighters in the world. So what do you think, guys? Do you think that Petr Yan's being, too overconfident approaching this fight? Or do you think that Aljamain will shut everyone up and do a huge Las Vegas heist, as he was saying? Let me know down in the comments below, and I will see you next one.